After signing the divorce papers, I walked away without a word. My millionaire ex nearly collapsed. The pen felt heavier than it should have. I sat in that cold conference room, surrounded by mahogany walls and the faint smell of old money, and I signed my name on the dotted line. Page after page, initial here, sign there, date this. My hand moved mechanically, like it belonged to someone else entirely. John sat across from me, barely containing his smile. That smile I used to love. That smile that had made me believe every lie he'd ever told me. Now it just looks like what it always was, the grin of a predator who thought he'd cornered his prey. His lawyer, a shark in a $3,000 suit named Harrison Webb, shuffled papers with the efficiency of a man who'd destroyed countless lives before mine. My lawyer, a court-appointed one I could barely afford after John had frozen our accounts, just sat there looking defeated. He tried his best, but he was a public defender going up against a legal team that charged more per hour than most people made in a month. I didn't fight. I didn't cry. I didn't say a single word. And that's what seemed to unsettle John the most. He'd expected tears. God, he'd been counting on them. He'd expected begging, pleading, the kind of emotional breakdown he'd witnessed dozens of times over our marriage whenever he threatened to leave. He'd expected me to fall apart the way I always did when he raised his voice, when he told me I was nothing without him, when he reminded me that everything we had was because of his brilliance, his charisma, his vision. But I just kept signing, my face completely blank, my hands steady as stone. I could feel his confusion growing with each page I turned. His foot started tapping under the table, a nervous habit he'd never been able to shake. Harrison Webb glanced at him once, a slight furrow in his brow, probably wondering why his client seemed more agitated now than he had at any point during the proceedings. When it was over, Webb announced that the proceedings were complete. His voice was smooth, practiced, utterly devoid of humanity. I'd lost almost everything. The house in Connecticut, the one with the garden I'd planted myself, the one where I'd imagined raising children someday. The investment accounts worth over $2 million. The stock options in Nexitech Solutions, the company I'd built from nothing while John smiled for cameras and shook hands with investors. All of it, gone. The only thing I walked away with was a 10-year-old company sedan that nobody wanted. A Honda Accord with a dent in the rear bumper and an air conditioning system that only worked half the time. John couldn't resist one last jab as we walked out of the building into the crisp autumn air. He looked at the old Honda Accord parked by the curb and laughed. That laugh I used to find charming, that laugh that now sounded like nails on a chalkboard. His lawyer chuckled politely. Leah, standing a few feet away pretending to check her phone, smirked. I didn't respond. I just kept walking. But I didn't walk toward the Honda. I walked past it. John's laughter faded mid-breath. I could feel his confusion burning into my back as I continued down the sidewalk, my heels clicking against the concrete with a rhythm that felt almost musical. I stopped at the edge of the curb and waited. The seconds stretched out. I could hear John saying something behind me. What is she doing? Where does she think she's going? But I didn't turn around. 30 seconds later, a black Maybach pulled up, sleek, silent. The kind of car that costs more than most people's houses. The kind of car that announces without a single word that the person inside it has more power than you could ever imagine. The tinted window rolled down slowly. I didn't look back. Not once. I just opened the door, feeling the soft leather beneath my fingers, and slid into the back seat. The interior smelled like luxury, subtle cologne, polished wood, success. But I heard it. Even through the closing door, I heard it. The sharp intake of breath, the stumbling footsteps, the way John's voice cracked, all that arrogance shattering like glass when he whispered, "Wait, is that's impossible. How does she—" I closed the door. The Maybach pulled away, smooth and silent as a shark through water. And in the side mirror, I watched my ex-husband's face transform. The arrogance melted away like ice in summer. The smugness disappeared. The superiority complex he'd worn like armor for years crumbled in an instant. What replaced it was something I'd never seen on John's face before in all our years together. Pure, undiluted fear. His lawyer was saying something to him, but John wasn't listening. He was frozen on that sidewalk, watching the Maybach disappear around the corner, his face pale as a ghost, his whole body trembling. Leah stepped up beside him, touching his arm, asking what was wrong, but John just kept staring at the empty street where the car had been. Who was in that car? And why did my ex-husband, the man who'd just taken everything from me, who'd spent years convincing me I was worthless, look like his entire world had just collapsed? Let me take you back to the beginning. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10 at the end. Now, let's continue. I met John Harrison at a tech conference in San Francisco 12 years ago. I was 24 years old, fresh out of MIT with a computer science degree and a head full of dreams. I just presented a paper on encryption algorithms that had gotten some attention in academic circles. A few professors had called it innovative, a couple of tech blogs had written small articles about it, but I was still a nobody, a shy girl from a small town in Ohio who'd worked her way through college on scholarships, part-time jobs at the campus library, and an unhealthy amount of ramen noodles. I didn't come from money. My dad was a mechanic, my mom a school secretary. They'd sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had, and I'd repaid them by burying myself in textbooks and computer screens, determined to make something of myself. John was everything I wasn't: charismatic, confident, the kind of guy who walked into a room and immediately became the center of attention without even trying. He had this energy about him, magnetic, electric, impossible to ignore. People gravitated toward him like planets around a sun. He was also incredibly handsome. Tall, with dark hair that always seemed perfectly tousled, blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a jawline that belonged in a magazine. When he looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. He found me hiding in a corner at the networking event, nursing a glass of water because I couldn't afford the $12 cocktails. I was wearing a dress I'd bought at a thrift store, hoping no one would notice it wasn't designer. I was trying to make myself invisible, counting down the minutes until I could escape back to my hotel room. "You're the encryption girl, aren't you?" he said, appearing beside me like he'd materialized from thin air. "I read your paper. Brilliant stuff." I nearly choked on my water. You read my paper?" He smiled that $1,000,000 smile, the one that would later grace magazine covers and conference stages. 3 times, actually. The part about asymmetric key distribution was fascinating. I've been thinking about its applications all week. I blushed so hard I thought my face would catch fire. Nobody talked about my work like that. Most people's eyes glazed over the moment I started explaining what I did. But John seemed genuinely interested, asking questions that showed he'd actually understood what I'd written. We talked for hours that night. He told me about his dreams of starting a tech company, something that would revolutionize how businesses operated. He had the vision, he said, but he needed someone with the technical skills to make it happen, someone who could translate his ideas into reality. Someone like me. I should have seen the warning signs even then. The way he positioned himself as the visionary and me as the implementer, the way he made it sound like his ideas were the valuable part and my skills were just a tool to execute them. But I was young, naive, and desperately lonely. Nobody had ever paid this much attention to me, made me feel this special, this seen. Within 6 months, we were dating. He swept me off my feet with romantic gestures, surprise flowers, handwritten notes, weekend trips to places I'd only seen in movies. He introduced me to his wealthy friends as my brilliant girlfriend, the genius who's going to change the world with me. Within a year, we were married. A beautiful ceremony in the Hamptons that his family paid for. I remember walking down the aisle, seeing him waiting for me at the altar, thinking I was the luckiest woman alive. Within 2 years, Nexatech Solutions was born. The concept was mine, every single line of it. a revolutionary software platform that could integrate multiple business systems, accounting, inventory, customer management, communications, into one seamless interface. I'd been developing the theoretical framework for years, scribbling notes in margins, coding prototypes on my ancient laptop during lunch breaks. John took one look at my ideas and declared them the future of business technology. He was right, of course, but the way he said it, like he was bestowing approval on my humble offering, should have been another warning sign. I spent 18 months coding the platform from scratch, 18 months of 16-hour days, of falling asleep at my keyboard, of surviving on coffee and determination. I wrote millions of lines of code, debugged thousands of errors, rebuilt entire systems when they didn't work right. I poured every ounce of my intelligence and creativity into that software. John, meanwhile, handled the business side, the meetings with investors where he pitched my technology as if he'd invented it himself, the dinners with potential clients, where he charmed them into signing contracts, the media appearances, where he explained our revolutionary product to journalists who assumed the handsome, charismatic man in the expensive suit must be the brains behind the operation. And slowly, without me even noticing, he became the face of the company. It made sense at first, or at least that's what I told myself. I hated public speaking. The thought of standing in front of a crowd made my stomach churn. I got nervous in meetings, stumbling over words, forgetting important points. John was a natural salesman who could convince anyone of anything. So while I stayed in my office writing code, he went out and sold our product to the world. The money started rolling in. First thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then millions. Nexitech became one of the hottest startups in the country, then one of the most valuable private tech companies. Tech magazines put John on their covers with headlines like "The Visionary Reshaping Business Technology." He gave keynote speeches at conferences where thousands of people hung on his every word. He was invited to exclusive parties with celebrities and politicians, to dinners at the White House, to galas where a single table cost more than my parents made in a year. And somewhere along the way, the man I married disappeared. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. Each day, a little more of the man I loved seemed to evaporate, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The John I fell in love with used to bring me coffee while I coded late at night, sitting beside me in comfortable silence while I worked. He'd read over my shoulder sometimes, not understanding the code, but wanting to be part of my world anyway. He used to read my technical papers and pretend to understand them just so we could discuss my ideas. He'd ask questions, genuine questions, and I'd explain things to him in simpler terms, and he'd look at me like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. He used to hold me when I got frustrated, telling me that I was the most brilliant person he'd ever met, that the world would see my genius someday, that he was lucky to be along for the ride. He used to talk about the family we'd have someday, 2 kids, maybe 3, a house with a big backyard where they could play while we watched from the porch, growing old together, building a life that mattered. The new John was a stranger, wearing my husband's face. He came home smelling like champagne and expensive perfume that wasn't mine. He rolled his eyes when I tried to tell him about a breakthrough I'd made in the code. He laughed, actually laughed, when I mentioned wanting to start trying for children. "A baby?" he said one night, loosening his tie after another party I hadn't been invited to. His eyes were slightly unfocused from too much scotch. "Layla, look at you. You can barely handle leaving the house. You think you can handle a kid?" The way he said it, so casual, so dismissive, like he was stating an obvious fact about the weather. I tried to tell myself it was stress. The pressure of running a successful company was getting to him. He'd come back to me once things settled down, once Nexitech was more established, once we'd proven ourselves. But things never settled down. They only got worse. John started criticizing everything about me, My clothes were too plain. Why couldn't I dress like the other tech wives in designer outfits that cost thousands of dollars? My hair was too boring. Had I ever considered getting it done professionally instead of cutting it myself? I didn't wear enough makeup. Didn't I want to look good for the events we attended, the rare ones where he actually brought me along? And those events, God, those events. I'd stand beside him while he worked the room, feeling like a piece of furniture. He'd introduce me as my wife, never by name, never mentioning that I was the one who'd created the technology everyone was so excited about. People would glance at me, smile politely, then turn back to John like I wasn't even there. "You embarrass me," he said after one particularly painful gala. "You just stand there like a statue. You can't make small talk. You can't network. You can't do anything useful." "I'm not good at these things," I whispered, fighting back tears. "You know that." He sighed, running a hand through his perfect hair. "That's exactly my point, Layla. You're brilliant with computers, but you're useless with people. Just stay home and do what you're good at. Leave the real work to me." So I did. I retreated further into my work, spending more and more time in my home office, perfecting the software that was making us rich. I told myself it was enough, that my contribution mattered, even if no one saw it, that John was right. I wasn't cut out for the spotlight, and there was nothing wrong with that. But the loneliness was crushing. I'd watch John leave for another gala, another dinner, another weekend trip to Aspen with investors, and I'd sit alone in our massive house, 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a home theater I never used, feeling like a ghost. I had everything money could buy, a closet full of clothes I'd never asked for, a car I was afraid to drive because it cost more than my parents' house, a kitchen with appliances I didn't know how to use because John insisted we have a personal chef. I had everything and nothing at the same time. The worst part? I started believing him. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every time he made me feel small, it all seeped into my brain like poison. I started thinking that maybe I really was too boring, too plain, too socially awkward to deserve anything better, that I should be grateful John stayed with me at all, that without him, I'd be nothing. That's what years of emotional abuse does to you. It rewires your brain until you can't tell the difference between truth and manipulation. It makes you question your own reality, your own worth, your own sanity. I was so deep in the fog that I almost missed the signs of what was really happening. Almost. It started with little things, the kind of details that seem insignificant on their own, but form a damning pattern when you put them together. John would come home and immediately shower, even if he'd supposedly been at a business dinner where the worst he should have encountered was some spilled wine. His phone was always face down on the table now, and he'd snatch it up the moment it buzzed, angling the screen away from me even though I'd never once asked to see his messages. He started working late more often, but when I called the office, no one answered, not even the night security guard who was always at his desk. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure, all the things John had accused me of being whenever I dared to question him about anything. He'd trained me well to doubt my own instincts. Then I met Leah Chen. She was 26, gorgeous, ambitious, everything John constantly reminded me I wasn't. Long, dark hair that was always perfectly styled, makeup that looked effortless but probably took an hour, clothes that hugged her figure in all the right places, and a smile that was just a little too bright whenever John was in the room. He hired her as a junior programmer about 8 months before everything fell apart. He introduced her at a company meeting as a rising star who would help take Nexatech to the next level. I noticed immediately that she wasn't that good at programming. Oh, she was competent. She could write decent code, debug basic problems, hold her own in technical discussions, but she wasn't exceptional. She wasn't innovative. She wasn't the kind of talent that would justify the salary John was paying her or the rapid promotions she kept receiving. The way he looked at her made my stomach turn. It was the way he used to look at me, that intense focus, that appreciative smile, that spark in his eyes that had been dead for years whenever he was around me. But it wasn't until I overheard them in his office one evening that I understood the full scope of his betrayal. I'd come to the company headquarters to pick up some files I needed for a project. It was late, nearly 9 o'clock, and I assumed everyone had gone home. The building was quiet, most of the lights off, just the hum of servers and the distant whir of the cleaning crew's vacuum somewhere on another floor. But as I walked past John's corner office, I heard voices. The door was cracked open just an inch or two, enough for me to hear every word if I stood perfectly still. "She's not going to be a problem," John was saying. His voice was casual, confident, the voice of a man who thought he'd already won. "The divorce will be clean. I've got Harrison Webb handling everything, and you know his track record. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her." Leah's voice was softer, harder to hear. "But what about the software, the source code?" John laughed. The sound of it, so smug, so self-satisfied, made my blood run cold. "That's the beautiful part," he said. "Layla thinks she's irreplaceable. She thinks that just because she wrote the code, the company would fall apart without her. But you've been studying her work for months now. How's that coming along?" A pause. Then Leah's voice, more confident now. "I've mapped about 70% of the core architecture. Another few weeks and I'll have the whole system documented. Once I understand all her proprietary methods, we won't need her anymore." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. My legs felt weak. My whole body felt weak. "And the company?" Leah asked. "She owns 40%. John's voice hardened. "Not for long. Webb's already working on it. We're going to argue that her contribution was minimal, just technical support while I built the business. That the real value of Nexatech is in the brand I created, the relationships I developed, the vision I implemented. By the time we're done, she'll be lucky to walk away with bus fare." They laughed together. The sound of it, so casual, so cruel, so utterly devoid of any recognition that they were discussing destroying a person's life, broke something inside me. And then John said something that shattered the last remnants of the woman I used to be. "You know what the best part is?" His voice was practically gleeful. "She actually thinks I ever loved her. Like I would choose that awkward, boring, mousy little nobody if I had any other option. She was always just a means to an end, a brain I could exploit until I didn't need her anymore." I slipped away before they could discover me. Down the hallway, into the elevator, out of the building. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through every possibility. They were going to steal everything from me. My company, my life's work, my future. The technology I'd created from nothing, that I'd poured years of my life into, that was mine in every way that mattered. And they thought I was too naive, too beaten down, too pathetically in love to see it coming. That night, something shifted inside me. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my mind for years suddenly lifted. It was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment I was the woman John had created, timid, insecure, grateful for scraps of attention. The next moment, I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as the charming man I'd married, not as the visionary entrepreneur the world celebrated, but as the predator he'd always been. The manipulator who targeted a brilliant, naive young woman and systematically dismantled her self-worth until she couldn't see her own value. And I realized something else, something that changed everything. I wasn't the helpless, useless, worthless woman he'd convinced me I was. I was the one who'd built Nexatech from nothing. I was the one who understood every line of code, every system architecture, every encryption protocol. I was the one who'd created something revolutionary while he smiled for cameras and took credit for my work. I was the one with the power. I just hadn't been using it. That night, I started planning. The first thing I did was create a failsafe. See, the Nexatech software wasn't just complex. It was built on a proprietary encryption system that I designed myself. Without the right keys, the entire platform would become unstable. Critical functions would fail. Data would corrupt. The whole system would slowly, inevitably, catastrophically collapse. I spent weeks implementing a hidden layer of security that no one knew about. Not John, not Leah. Not even the other engineers who worked on peripheral parts of the system. To anyone looking at the code, everything appeared normal. The architecture seemed sound. The functions ran smoothly. But deep in the core, buried beneath millions of lines of code, I'd created dependencies that only I could maintain. Encryption keys that existed only in my memory. Complex algorithmic sequences that I'd never written down anywhere. Backdoors that would activate automatically if I didn't input a specific sequence every 30 days. It was my insurance policy, my guarantee that they couldn't simply discard me and keep the golden goose. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, John had called me paranoid whenever I suggested we needed better security protocols. Too cautious, he'd say, dismissing my concerns. We don't need to be Fort Knox, Layla. Just make it work. But my caution, my attention to detail, my obsession with doing things right, all the things he'd mocked me for were about to save my future and destroy his. The second thing I did was start moving money. Not much. John monitored our joint accounts like a hawk, scrutinizing every purchase, questioning every withdrawal. But I had a small personal account from before our marriage, one he didn't know about, one my mother had insisted I keep just in case. I began quietly funneling what I could into it, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, cash back on grocery purchases, returns on items I'd supposedly bought, freelance consulting fees paid directly to my personal account. Nothing that would raise red flags if anyone looked, but enough that I'd have a foundation when everything fell apart. The third thing I did was start building something new. For years, I'd had ideas for improving the Nexitech platform, revolutionary concepts, artificial intelligence integration, predictive analytics, quantum-resistant encryption that John had dismissed as too risky or too complicated. He preferred safe, incremental improvements that wouldn't rock the boat. But I'd kept those ideas, documented them in private files, developed theoretical frameworks in my spare time. And now, working late at night while John was out with Leah or partying with his wealthy friends, I began turning those ideas into reality. I called it Phoenix. The name felt right. A mythical bird that rises from its own ashes, reborn stronger and more beautiful than before. That's what I was going to do. That's what this software represented. Not just a product, but my resurrection. It was everything Nexitech could have been and more. Faster by orders of magnitude, more secure than anything on the market, more intuitive, more powerful, more revolutionary. A complete reimagining of business integration software that would make our current product look like a child's toy. Every night after John left for his parties and dinners, I'd sit at my computer and lose myself in the code. It was therapeutic in a way. Each line I wrote was a brick in the foundation of my new life. Each problem I solved was proof that I wasn't the useless woman John said I was. Sometimes I'd work until dawn, the sky lightening outside my window while I put the finishing touches on another module. I'd drag myself to bed for a few hours of sleep, then wake up and pretend to be the defeated wife John expected while secretly counting down the days until my escape. But I couldn't launch Phoenix alone. I needed a partner, someone with resources, connections, and credibility in the tech world. Someone who could help me build a company while I focused on the technology. Someone like David Lynch. David was a legend in our industry, not the household name that billionaires like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos are, but everyone in the tech world knew who he was. He'd founded 3 successful companies over the course of his career, taken 2 of them public, and had a reputation for recognizing talent that others overlooked. While most investors chase trends and buzzwords, David looked for substance, for innovation, for the kind of genuine brilliance that built lasting companies. More importantly, he'd tried to recruit me 5 years ago. It had happened at a conference, much like the one where I'd met John. David had approached me after a presentation, one that John had given, taking credit for the technology I'd developed, and said something I'd never forgotten. "You're the real genius behind that company, Layla. I've read your academic papers. I've analyzed Nexitech's architecture. I know whose mind created it. And I think it's a crime that the world doesn't know too." I'd been flustered, confused, flattered. No one had ever said anything like that to me. "If you ever want to build something of your own," he continued, handing me a business card, "call me. I'd be honored to work with you." I'd turned him down at the time. John had convinced me that leaving Nexitech would be disloyal, that I owed everything to our partnership, that David was just trying to poach talent and couldn't be trusted. But I kept that card, tucked it into a book on my shelf, looked at it sometimes when I was feeling particularly lost, wondering what might have been. Now I finally knew. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to make the call. 3 weeks of second-guessing myself, of wondering if David would even remember me, of imagining all the ways this could go wrong. When I finally dialed the number, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. David picked up on the second ring. "Layla Mitchell," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years." I told him everything, meeting in a quiet cafe far from any Nexitech employees, speaking in low tones. I laid out the whole ugly truth: the betrayal, the affair, the plan to steal my work and push me out with nothing, the divorce that John was orchestrating, and the fail-safe I'd built into Nexitech's systems, the insurance policy that meant they couldn't simply replace me and move on. David listened without interrupting. His expression grew darker as I spoke, his jaw tightening at the worst parts, but he let me tell the whole story without a single interjection. And then I told him about Phoenix. I pulled out my laptop, showed him the code I'd developed, explained the concepts that made it revolutionary. I talked about AI integration, about predictive algorithms, about security protocols that would make current encryption look like a child's diary lock. I talked for almost 2 hours, the words pouring out of me like water from a dam that had finally broken. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then David said, "When can you start?" We spent the next 2 months preparing in absolute secrecy. David provided the funding, enough to rent office space, hire a small team of trusted developers, purchase the equipment we needed. He provided the business infrastructure, legal frameworks, corporate structures, investor relationships, and he provided something else that I hadn't realized how desperately I needed: respect. David wasn't like John. He didn't try to take credit for my work or position himself as the visionary while I was the mere implementer. When we had meetings with potential investors, he always introduced me as the mastermind behind the technology. When I explained complex concepts, he listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions instead of checking his phone or interrupting to redirect the conversation to himself. He treated me like an equal, like a partner, like someone whose contributions actually mattered. One night, after a particularly long coding session, he brought me takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, a little place downtown that did amazing pad see ew. "How did you know I like Thai food?" I asked, surprised. He shrugged. "You mentioned it once, about 6 weeks ago. You said it reminded you of your college days when you were too broke to eat anything fancy, but there was this one Thai restaurant near campus that made you feel like you were having a special meal anyway." I stared at him. John and I had been married for 10 years, and he couldn't remember if I liked Thai food or Indian food. He'd never once picked up dinner without asking me first what I wanted, and even then he'd usually get it wrong. David noticed my expression. "What?" "Nothing," I said, feeling something warm bloom in my chest. "It's just, thank you for everything." He smiled, not the practiced, charming smile that John used on everyone, but something genuine, something real. "You're going to change this industry, Layla. I'm just lucky enough to have a front row seat." I felt tears prick at my eyes. Not sad tears, something else entirely. Relief, maybe, or wonder, or the simple, profound emotion of being truly seen for the first time in years. David noticed. "Hey," he said softly, reaching out to touch my arm. "You okay?" I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then I found my voice. "It's just, no one's ever believed in me like this. Not really. Not without wanting something in return." His expression softened. "Then everyone else has been a fool, because believing in you is the easiest thing I've ever done." At that moment, I realized that whatever happened next, I'd already won, because I'd finally found someone who saw me for who I really was. Not as a shadow, not as a supporting character in someone else's story, as the star of my own. Meanwhile, John served me with divorce papers. He did it with typical cruelty. Had a process server show up at my door while I was in the middle of dinner, alone, as usual. The man handed me a thick envelope with a practiced apologetic expression and walked away without another word. The papers were thick, filled with legal jargon that basically said I deserved nothing. Hundreds of pages documenting why everything we'd built together was actually John's, why my contributions were merely technical support, that I was just a consultant, essentially, while John built the real business, that the software I'd created, every single line of code, was work for hire that belonged entirely to the company, which John controlled. The prenup we'd signed, another thing John had pressured me into, presenting it just weeks before our wedding, telling me it was a mere formality that his family's lawyers required, meant I had almost no claim to the assets we'd accumulated during our marriage. Any other woman might have fought, hired her own shark lawyer, dragged the case out for years, made John pay for every cruel word he'd ever spoken. But I didn't do any of that. I let John think he was winning. I attended the mediation sessions with a meek expression and a court-appointed lawyer who was clearly outmatched. I didn't contest the asset division. I didn't demand my fair share of the company. I didn't mention the affair with Leah or the conversation I'd overheard. I just sat there, quiet and defeated, exactly the way John expected me to be, exactly the way he trained me to be. The only thing I asked for was the old Honda Accord that the company kept for running errands. It was practically worthless, a decade-old sedan with over 100,000 miles on it, a dent in the bumper, and an air conditioning system that wheezed more than it cooled. John laughed when he heard my request. His lawyer looked at mine like he couldn't believe this was actually happening. "Sure," John said, magnanimous in victory. "Take the junker. You're gonna need it." He had no idea that I didn't need anything from him anymore. The morning of the final divorce hearing, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The sun was streaming through the windows of my small apartment. I'd moved out of the Connecticut house months ago, into a modest place that John didn't know about. I put on my best dress, the one I'd bought with my own money, a deep blue that brought out my eyes, the one John had said made me look like a librarian. I did my hair the way I liked it, down and natural, not the complicated updo he'd always insisted on. I put on subtle makeup that made me feel confident, not the dramatic look he'd preferred. And when I signed those papers in the conference room, surrendering everything he thought mattered, I did it with a smile in my heart, because I knew something John didn't. In exactly 24 hours, his whole world was going to come crashing down, and mine was about to begin. Which brings us back to that moment on the sidewalk. The Maybach door closed behind me, sealing out the autumn air in John's shocked expression. The leather seat was soft beneath me. The interior was quiet, peaceful, a world away from the chaos I'd left behind on that courthouse sidewalk. David Lynch sat beside me in the back seat, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I'm better than okay," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in years. "I'm free." He reached over and squeezed my hand. His grip was warm and strong and reassuring. "Then let's go celebrate. We have a launch to prepare for." But first, I took one last look in the side mirror. John was still standing there, frozen on the sidewalk like a statue. Harrison Webb was saying something to him, gesturing urgently, but John wasn't listening. He was staring at the Maybach as it disappeared around the corner, his face pale as a sheet of paper, his whole body rigid with shock. He'd recognized David. Everyone in the tech industry knew David Lynch. His face, his reputation, his track record of turning brilliant innovators into billionaires. And now John was wondering why his boring, useless, forgettable ex-wife was riding away with one of the most powerful men in the business. The answer, of course, was that I'd never been any of those things. He'd just been too arrogant to see it, too focused on himself to notice what was right in front of him, too convinced of his own superiority to imagine that the woman he'd dismissed as worthless might actually be the most valuable thing he'd ever had. The next morning, John and Leah were at the Nexatech headquarters, popping champagne. I know this because several former colleagues told me about it later, after everything fell apart. They described the scene in vivid detail, how John had gathered the whole company for an announcement, how he'd practically glowed with triumph, how Leah had stood beside him in a designer dress that probably cost more than most of the employees' monthly salaries. Without the dead weight holding us back, John had said, glancing at the door as if I might walk through it at any moment, we're going to take this company to new heights. A new era is beginning for Nexatech. And I'm proud to announce that Leah Chen will be stepping into an expanded role as our new Chief Technology Officer. There was awkward applause. Most of the employees had liked me. They knew who really kept the systems running, who actually answered their technical questions, who stayed late to fix critical bugs while John was at parties. But John was the boss, and no one wanted to risk their job by questioning him. Leah smiled and gave a little speech about innovation and the future, using buzzwords she didn't really understand, making promises she couldn't possibly keep. Someone popped another champagne bottle, and then, exactly 47 minutes into the celebration, the alert started. First, it was just one server going down, a minor glitch, people assumed. These things happened. Someone rebooted it and went back to their champagne. Then another server crashed, and another, and the customer-facing portal started throwing errors, and the internal systems began displaying warning messages that nobody had ever seen before. Within an hour, Nexatech was in complete chaos. Clients were calling, furious that they couldn't access their data. The sales team was fielding cancellation threats and demands for refunds. The engineering department was running around like ants from a kicked anthill, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And Leah, the supposed technical genius who was going to replace me, was completely, utterly, hopelessly lost. The code was too complex, the architecture was too intricate, the encryption protocols were too sophisticated for someone who'd only mapped 70% of the surface-level systems. She hadn't even begun to understand the deep core, the fundamental algorithms that everything else depended on. And the encryption keys that held everything together, the ones that needed to be refreshed every 30 days, they simply didn't exist in any documentation, any backup, any file she could access, because they only existed in my head. She tried everything, rebooting servers, rolling back updates, running diagnostic programs. She even called in external consultants, specialists who charged $5,000 an hour and watched them scratch their heads in confusion. Nothing worked. Every fix they attempted made things worse. Every patch they applied created new problems. The system was designed to be maintained by one person, and that person was no longer answering their calls. Clients were threatening lawsuits. The board was demanding answers. Employees were updating their resumes and quietly sending them out, sensing the ship was sinking. The worst part, for John, I imagine, was the realization dawning slowly, horribly, that he'd underestimated me. All those years of dismissing my work, of calling me a simple technician, of believing the company's success was due to his brilliance and my contribution was merely execution, now he was learning the truth the hard way. John, meanwhile, was spiraling. He called me 37 times that day. I know because I watched every single call go to voicemail, let every single ring echo through my apartment without picking up. His messages started out angry. Layla, what the hell did you do? Call me back right now. I know you're behind this. Then they got desperate. Please, Layla, I know we ended badly, but people's livelihoods are at stake here. Think about the employees. Think about the clients. Just tell me how to fix this. Then accusatory. This is sabotage. This is illegal. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you have. And finally, pathetic. I'm begging you. I'll give you whatever you want. Money, stock, the house in Connecticut, anything. Just please, please help me. I didn't respond to any of them. By the end of the day, 3 of Nexitech's biggest clients, companies that had signed multi-million-dollar contracts, had terminated their agreements. The company's stock, which John had taken public just 8 months earlier in a celebrated IPO, had dropped 40%. Financial analysts were using words like catastrophic and unprecedented and death spiral. And John himself had to be helped out of the building by 2 employees after he nearly collapsed from a panic attack in his office. Someone recorded it on their phone. The video, John, ashen-faced, hyperventilating, being practically carried to his car while Leah tried unsuccessfully to calm him down, made its way around the tech industry within hours. By morning, it had over 1 million views. That same evening, I was across town at the soft launch for Phoenix. It was a small gathering, just 50 or so of the most influential people in tech, investors and journalists and industry analysts who David had personally invited. The venue was elegant but understated, a rooftop space in Manhattan with a view of the city lights. I stood at the front of the room in a dress I'd bought myself, emerald green, simple but striking, feeling more confident than I had in years, maybe more confident than I'd ever felt in my entire life. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said, his voice carrying across the elegant space, "I've spent my career looking for the next breakthrough in business technology. I've invested in dozens of companies. I've seen innovations come and go, and I'm here to tell you that what I'm about to show you is different. Phoenix isn't just an improvement on existing platforms, it's a complete reimagining of what's possible." He paused and smiled at me. "And the genius behind it is standing right here, the most talented programmer I've ever had the privilege of working with, the real mastermind behind more innovation than most people realize, Layla Mitchell." The applause was warm and genuine. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "Phoenix represents everything I've learned in 15 years of software development, everything I've dreamed about, everything I was never allowed to build before. It's faster, more secure, and more intuitive than anything else on the market, and starting tonight, it's available for beta testing." The demonstration went flawlessly. I walked them through the features, showing off capabilities that made their eyes widen. I answered their questions with confidence, diving deep into technical details when they asked, explaining simply when they needed clarity. I watched their expressions shift from polite interest to genuine excitement to something approaching awe. By the end of the night, we had commitments from 12 major companies to pilot the software. David estimated that within 6 months, Phoenix would be valued at over $100 million. Within a year, maybe 5 times that. And I owned 50% of it, not 40% like I'd had in Nexitech, a share that John had constantly worked to diminish. 50%, equal partners, the way it should have been from the beginning. After the guests left, David and I stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The night was cool, the air crisp, the skyline glittering like a field of stars brought down to earth. "You did it," he said softly. "You really did it." "We did it," I corrected him. He turned to look at me, and something in his expression made my breath catch. His eyes were soft in the dim light, thoughtful, full of something I hadn't let myself hope for. "Layla," he said, "I need to tell you something. These past few months, working with you, I've never met anyone like you. And I know the timing is terrible, and I know you just went through hell, but—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the words. This man who always knew exactly what to say, who commanded boardrooms and convinced billionaires, was suddenly tongue-tied. I reached up and touched his face. "The timing is perfect," I said, "because for the first time in my life, I know exactly what I want, and I'm not afraid to reach for it anymore." When he kissed me, it felt like the beginning of everything. The aftermath of Nexitec's collapse was swift and brutal. Within 2 weeks, the company had lost 80% of its clients. The stock became essentially worthless. Investors who'd bought in during the IPO saw their money evaporate overnight. Lawsuits started piling up. Regulatory agencies started asking questions. And the questions led to discoveries that had nothing to do with me. The SEC investigation revealed that John had been funneling company money into personal accounts for years. Luxury purchases disguised as business expenses, investment properties bought with corporate funds, a yacht that was supposedly for client entertainment, but that John used exclusively for personal trips. The IRS got involved, then the FBI. It turned out that John's schemes went far beyond what I'd overheard that night in his office. He'd been cooking the books for years, inflating revenue numbers, hiding expenses, presenting a picture of financial health that had nothing to do with reality. The IPO, that celebrated moment that had made him a paper billionaire, had been built on fraudulent financial statements. John was arrested 3 months later, charged with securities fraud, embezzlement, and a dozen other crimes I didn't fully understand. His lawyer, that same shark, Harrison Webb, who'd helped him take everything from me, dropped him as a client the moment the indictments came down. The news coverage was relentless. John's face, once on magazine covers celebrating his genius, was now splashed across headlines about corporate crime and hubris. The man who'd been celebrated as a visionary was now being called a con artist, a fraud, a symbol of everything wrong with Silicon Valley. Leah disappeared somewhere in the chaos. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved back to the Midwest, taken a job at a regional IT company, given up on her dreams of tech stardom. I never saw her again, and I never tried to find out what happened to her. She wasn't worth my energy anymore. As for me, Phoenix launched officially 6 months after that soft launch. The reception was everything we'd hoped for and more. Within a year, it was one of the top business software platforms in the world, used by Fortune 500 companies and startups alike. Within 2 years, we went public at a valuation that made my stake worth more than everything Nexitec had ever been: $3 billion. The girl from Ohio, the mechanic's daughter who'd survived on ramen and worked 3 jobs to get through college, was now one of the wealthiest women in tech. Magazines put me on their covers, not standing behind someone else, not identified as someone's wife, but me, Layla Mitchell, innovator, entrepreneur, CEO. The headlines wrote themselves. The real genius behind Nexitec rises from the ashes, from scorned wife to billionaire CEO, the woman who built 2 tech empires. David and I got married on a beach in Maui, surrounded by friends who actually cared about us. Real friends, not the sycophants John used to parade around with. My parents flew out for the ceremony, and my mother cried happy tears the entire time. It was small and intimate and absolutely perfect. And yes, we eventually had kids. 2 of them. A girl named Hope, because that's what she represented. The dreams I thought were impossible finally coming true. And a boy named Marcus, after my grandfather, the one who'd always told me I was destined for great things. They're the light of my life. And David is the kind of father I always dreamed of having for my children. Present, patient, endlessly loving. He reads them bedtime stories and helps with homework and coaches Marcus's little league team. He's everything John never was and never could have been. Sometimes I think about John, serving his 15-year sentence in a federal prison somewhere. I hear he tried to reach out once, wrote me a letter that I never opened. I don't know what it said, and I don't care. When I think about him now, I feel nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even relief, just a profound sense of peace. Like that chapter of my life has been completely closed, and there's no reason to ever reopen it. Because the truth is, John did me a favor. All those years of telling me I was worthless, all that cruelty and manipulation and emotional abuse, it forced me to find my own strength. It made me look deep inside myself and discover resources I didn't know I had. It pushed me to the edge of a cliff, and when I didn't fall, I realized I could fly. John thought he was breaking me. Instead, he set me free. Looking back now, I can see how every terrible thing that happened led me exactly where I needed to be. The loneliness taught me to find strength within myself. The criticism taught me to trust my own judgment. The betrayal taught me who I really was. Not the diminished version John had created, but the powerful, capable, brilliant woman who'd been hiding inside all along. I don't regret my years with John. I can't. Because without them, I wouldn't have Next Attack on my resume. I wouldn't have developed the skills that made Phoenix possible. And most importantly, I wouldn't have met David at that conference all those years ago. The man who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself, who waited patiently until I was ready to reach for something better. Every scar tells a story. And my story, I realize now, was always heading toward this moment, toward freedom, toward success, toward love. If you're watching this and you're in a situation like mine, trapped in a relationship that makes you feel small, surrounded by people who don't see your value, convinced that you're somehow less than you actually are, I want you to know something. You are not what they say you are. You are not useless. You are not boring. You are not worthless. You are not too plain or too awkward or too anything. You are a phoenix waiting to rise. It might take time. It might take planning. It might take the hardest decision you've ever made. It might mean walking away from everything you thought you knew, everyone you thought you needed, the whole life you thought you were supposed to live. But someday, you're going to walk away from whoever is holding you down. You're going to find your wings, and you're going to build something beautiful with your life. And the people who doubted you, the ones who laughed at you, the ones who thought they could use you and throw you away like you meant nothing, they're going to watch you soar. And they're going to realize far too late that they lost the best thing they ever had. The universe has a way of balancing the scales. Karma doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years, but it always comes. And when it does, it's not about revenge. It's about justice. It's about finally getting what you deserve. So hold on. Keep fighting. Keep believing in yourself, even when no one else does, especially when no one else does. Because your moment is coming. And when it does, you won't just survive, you'll thrive. Trust me, I know, because I'm living proof. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories. See you next time.